Hey everyone, it's Tutor Brian. In this video, I'm doing a review on a book I've read. It's called The Saint's Guide to Happiness: Practical Lessons in the Life of the Spirit by Robert Ellsberg. It was a book that I got on Amazon for $13 to $14. The list price says it's $15, so just around that, I guess under $15 range. And this book spoke to me as soon as I started reading it. It felt like it was something that, like it says, is practical. You can use it in your own daily life. You can incorporate some of the things that it's teaching, preaching. And it's not necessarily a bunch of mini biographies of several of the saints that the author chooses to mention. It's more of a teaching book, like it says, practical lessons. And the chapter headings show each of the lessons that the author is trying to convey. Let's see. So the chapters go: learning to be alive, learning to let go, learning to work, learning to sit still, learning to love, learning to suffer, learning to die, learning to see. And one of the things that really struck me about this book is the sober tone of it. It's by no means a book that harbors illusions of helping people find happiness as is normally defined. It's not like a book that is a, I guess, gimmick self-help book, or a book that provides like some type of silver bullet or magic bullet, or something that is kind of more advertising than practical. When I first read the book, I didn't really get to enjoy each of the lessons in each chapter, some of the wisdom provided, as much as I'd like. The first time through the book, I was trying to keep up pace, finish within a certain time period for book club, and so I was rushing it. But like reading scripture, it is probably best to take this book and savor some of the wisdom, the tidbits of knowledge that it provides, and not try to go through it so quickly. You can just open at any moment and just read about a lesson, and it will be something that it can be enjoyed. Not necessarily it has to be sequential order or from cover to end. It can just be at any, flip it open and just find something that can be useful. So after reading the first time, I liked it, and I wanted to go through it again and take my time. So I read it a second time almost immediately after finishing it the first time, and kind of slowed it down and try to enjoy each of the chapters, try to gain some more knowledge to really squeeze as much out of the sponge as possible of each of the sections. And the way I just like to think of the way it is written is, the lesson is what is listed in the chapter heading, and the author provides some of his insight, and some of the insights that can be gleaned from studying the life of the saints, some of the teachings of the saints, some of the wisdom that they provide, the things they've written and said. And it's just kind of interwoven between the lesson of the chapter, the knowledge of the saint that is mentioned, or even if it's not a canonized saint, just some historically relevant person that can provide insight into the topic at hand. And it just goes through like that. The author provides a lot of his own experience with people he's dealt with personally and people that he's studied. So it doesn't have a heavy feel of like a bunch of autobiographies or a bunch of biographies, and it doesn't have a feel of like this is the trick that will make you happy or lead to happiness. And one of the biggest lessons that is mentioned here is to change the perception of what happiness is, not looking so much as a subjective feeling to define happiness, but more of an objective state, a reality, if you will. Think of it as kind of a condition, like your health would be a condition. How healthy are you? So how happy are you? But not so much by what you feel, some of those elusive, temporary things, more so something like the condition of your soul, looking at it that way. And it's one thing for me to just give my take on what this book can do, what it conveys. It's another thing to actually go through and look at some of the passages themselves. To give an example of how the writing is in this book, so some of the content, I'm just going to go through, read briefly a little bit from the first few chapters. Chapter 1, Learning to be Alive. The sorrows of life are many, but sorrow is not the opposite of happiness. At least in sorrow we are aware of being alive. So often the problem is not really sorrow, but the deadness that attends our daily existence, the pace and pressures of the world, the struggle to make a living, the disquiet driven by constant advertising, the distracting drone of consumer culture. All these contribute to fatigue, numbness, and inability to feel anything at all. Our bodies may thrive. No generation has ever enjoyed such long life or good health, yet there is a sickness that eats away at our souls. We can see it in the faces of commuters on a train or shoppers in the mall. Too often it is in the face we encounter in the mirror. But we may also see it in the faces in church. Religion in itself offers no special immunity against deadness. Chapter 2, Learning to Let Go. How happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. With these words, Jesus introduced the Beatitudes, a preamble to the Sermon on the Mount, and a distillation of his essential teachings. Generations past counting have pondered this beatitude, wondering to what degree the happiness of spiritual poverty obliges one to be actually poor, or perhaps, more to the point, to what degree Jesus' intentions can be reconciled with the pursuit of private property. But whatever Jesus had in mind, this much is clear. It is difficult to reconcile his intentions with the spirit of the modern shopping mall. Our society surrounds us with a great cloud of enticement. Wherever we turn, we confront the claim that happiness is just around the corner, a matter of having more or better or newer things. Chapter 3, Learning to Work. In their caves in the desert, far from any employer or taskmaster, the early monks devoted a good part of every day to manual labor, gardening, basket making, or weaving. Thus they provided for their material needs, heeding St. Paul's fierce injunction, "If anyone will not work, let him not eat." Far from regarding such work as a distraction from their spiritual goal, they embraced it as a blessing, a kind of occupational therapy to ward off boredom and sadness. From the legends of the Desert Fathers, it is clear that such work had a value in itself, quite apart from any wider utility or reward. A typical story concerns one Abba Paul, who, like his fellow hermits, spent much of his time weaving baskets of palm fronds. When the baskets filled his cave to capacity, he would set fire to them all and start again. Chapter 4. Learning to Sit Still. The remote kingdom of Bhutan sits quietly in the shadow of the Himalayas. Some years ago, the king of Bhutan made a curious pronouncement that attracted a good deal of attention. He declared that the national policy of his small Buddhist country was aimed not at increasing the gross national product, but at increasing what he called gross national happiness. Whatever meaning this held for his subjects, it had the effect of attracting a great stream of foreign tourists and broadcast journalists, all eager to discover for themselves the secret of the happy kingdom. Many of these visitors returned with reports of a people who, though materially poor, do indeed display an evident contentment with life. While the Bhutanese lack many of the benefits of modern technology, they are not impoverished. In fact, by certain criteria, they enjoy an enviable prosperity. Chapter 5. Learning to Love. William Blake, the English poet and visionary artist, left a concise definition of the path to holiness. He wrote, "We are put on earth for a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love." Blake, who regularly conversed with angels in his garden, was equally eccentric in matters spiritual and artistic, yet his statement accords with the wisdom of the saints. They all have agreed that sanctification is a matter of being conformed to God, of steadily putting off the old person and putting on Christ, whose nature is simply love itself. Chapter 6. Learning to Suffer. It may seem foolish to speak of suffering in connection with the pursuit of happiness. No pain, no gain, the saying goes, but that applies to dieting and exercise. Real pain is something else. Surely, happiness, whatever this word implies, requires the greatest possible distance between ourselves and everything that hurts, where otherwise we might be inclined to pass. Yet suffering will come to us all the same. It is not astonishing to learn that we can find happiness through work, through love, through inner peace, or detachment from everyday cares. Each of these pursuits, after all, implies a certain contentment. But to say that we shall be happy if only we learn to be content is a mere tautology. Our contentment is thin fare if it can be undone by a flea, a spark, a patch of ice, a broken twig. Chapter 7. Learning to Die. From a certain point of view, it is impossible to reconcile happiness with the thought, much less the reality, of death. A tendency to dwell on death is one of the symptoms of melancholia. Those in its grip are prone to see the cloud in every sky, the shadow of mortality behind every rose. Such persons are generally not the best of company. Against every bit of good news, they constantly remind us, yes, but tomorrow we shall all be dead. And if this were not actually true, it would not cast such a pall. At the opposite extreme, of course, there is a manic optimism that denies any sense of mortality. We see it in television commercials set in the land of eternal youth, or in the faces of people fiercely working out in the gym. According to this view, all that matters is that we are alive today. Now, I'm going over the first part of the conclusion, which is written in the author's point of view. Granted, it can be a spoiler of sorts, so if you don't want to know how it wraps up, then stop watching now. As Ellsberg says, I have spent much of my life reading books about saints, medieval legends, spiritual memoirs, martyrologies, and manuals of devotion. If that is all that it takes to be happy, then As Thomas Merton says, I should have been a very happy person, a spiritual millionaire, from the cradle even until now. Yet with happiness, as with holiness, it is not what we read, but what we practice that makes the difference. Each day brings new failures. I become impatient, I worry about small things, and take other people for granted. I give in to distractions and remain inattentive to signs of grace. I daydream about heroic deeds while neglecting countless opportunities for charity. And yet, like everyone else, I yearn to be happy. This desire is one of the marks of being human, a sign that we are called to a more abundant life. No less than others, I have looked for happiness in one place or another, imagining it would follow once I had realized some ambition or had resolved a looming crisis. But experience has only confirmed the wisdom of the saints, both those I have studied and those I have known, whose happiness did not hinge on passing feelings or outward circumstances. They have shown that the true happiness we all desire is the other side of the holiness to which we are called. The two proceed from the same practice and converge on the same goal. If holiness were the same as genius or moral perfection, then the goal would concern only a few. But holiness is not about possessing the right stuff, nor is it a code or prescription we must follow. It is more like a habit of being, a certain fullness of life or loveliness of the spirit. It is a name for that quality by virtue of which all things or persons fulfill the purpose and reason for being, yet it does not just happen. Such holiness, as the preceding chapters describe, is the fruit of considerable work and practice. On this path we are never finished. We remain always and only on the way. For that reason, instead of talking about saints as if they represented some kind of different creature, we might prefer to speak of those who walk the paths of holiness. At once we have a sense of what unites us with the saints, our fellow travelers, much deeper than all that sets us apart. We are all saints in progress, to the extent that we desire to be. Some, to be sure, progress further than others, but St. Paul made no distinctions when he addressed his readers as saints. They were saints by virtue of their calling to be saints. By the same token, there is no way to happiness, but there is a way of happiness, a way of lightness and balance, a way that allows us to take in experience and give it back with humanity and forgiveness, a way that wakens us to the particularity of each moment as well as its sacred depths. So often we proceed as though looking through a mental telescope, trained above the heads of our fellow humans, and what we see seems petty, commonplace, and meaningless. But then comes a moment when our yearning for happiness joins paths with a call to holiness. In the focus that ensues, we see the world in a new light, and in that light, ordinary life becomes not only infinitely valuable, but radiant and engrossing. So that was a kind of wrap-up that really summarizes, recaps, makes it all, or pieces it all together, all these lessons, all these little knowledge tidbits from the saints that are mentioned, some of the people that are mentioned, the places, the author's personal experiences, and he has said it in a much better way than I could hope to summarize, recap, review this book. And so that last part is kind of what ties it all together. And after reading this book 2 times, I would definitely say it is a good book to own, to keep going through, just opening it every now and then and getting a little bit better at the knowledge that the saints can provide as far as happiness.